"She's just a fake soldier!" my mom sneered, her voice dripping with pity as the will was read. Sloan smirked, certain the billions were already his. But when my lawyer handed the judge the red-sealed envelope, the room went ice cold. The judge scanned my clearance, the name Echo 7, and his face went ghostly pale as he looked at me with sudden, terrifying respect. "Officers," he choked out, "seal this court. Now!" That reckoning was coming, but first, I had to survive the night it all began. I stepped out of the sedan, the Boston wind biting at my skin, and walked toward the entrance, ready to step into the theater they had built for my humiliation. The ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza was a cathedral of gilded lies. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears from the vaulted ceiling, casting a shimmering amber glow over the cream of Boston society. I stood near the marble pillars, the shadows acting as my only honest companion. My fingers traced the silk of my dark navy dress, modest, functional, and entirely invisible in a room filled with sequins and ego. I wasn't here to be seen. I was here to witness. I watched my mother, Othello, standing at the center of a swirling tide of silk and perfume. At 62, she commanded the room with a spine of iron and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. To the elite of Beacon Hill, she was a paragon of charity. To me, she was the architect of a silence that had lasted a decade. Beside her stood my brother, Sloan, adjusting his cufflinks with the nervous precision of a man whose bank accounts were bleeding out. I've spent the last 10 years as a case officer for the DIA. In my world, a person's true character isn't revealed by how they treat their equals, but by how they treat those they deem useless. To Othello and Sloan, I was worse than useless. I was a disappointment, a policy analyst with a boring desk job in DC who couldn't even manage to find a husband or a prestigious title. I lived in the quiet footnotes of their loud lives, an invisible ghost at my own family's table. As I moved through the crowd, a glass shattered near the buffet. An elderly man, a veteran wearing a faded Legion cap, had stumbled. The socialites nearby stepped back, their expressions shifting to mild annoyance, as if his frailty were a smudge on the evening's aesthetic. I moved instinctively. Before the waitstaff could intervene, I was at his side, steadying his arm. His hand was gnarled, trembling with age. "I've got you, sir," I whispered, my voice steady. "Take your time. The floor is a bit slick tonight." He looked at me, his eyes cloudy but sharp with a sudden recognition of the respect in my tone. "Thank you, young lady. My legs aren't what they used to be at Normandy." "Your legs have carried enough for all of us," I replied, helping him to a nearby chair. I stayed with him for a moment, not for the cameras, but because honor isn't a performance. It's a debt. The warmth of that interaction was severed by the sharp feedback of a microphone. The room fell silent as Othello took the podium. The gala was ostensibly for veteran housing, a cause she championed with the fervor of a saint while knowing nothing of the mud or the blood. "Tonight is about service." Othello's voice boomed, rich and practiced. "It is about the sacrifices that bind us, and tonight I must speak from the heart about my own family." The spotlight swung. It didn't glide, it hunted. It cut through the dimness and pinned me against the marble pillar like a specimen on a board. I felt the collective gaze of 300 people turn toward me. Sloan stood at the edge of the stage, his face a mask of faux sympathy. "My daughter, Vianna, is here tonight," Othello continued, her voice dipping into a theatrical tremolo. "Many of you know she works in DC. What many of you don't know, and what breaks a mother's heart to admit, is the burden she carries. Vianna has struggled for years with a certain mental instability. She has retreated into a fantasy world where she believes she is a high-level government operative. She claims military service that never happened to cope with the reality of a life that hasn't quite launched." The room erupted into a collective, pitying gasp. It was the perfect execution. By labeling me a fake soldier in front of the city's most influential figures, she wasn't just embarrassing me. She was preemptively stripping me of my credibility before my father's will could even be read. She was burying the truth under a mountain of public pity. Sloan stepped forward, nodding to a prominent judge in the front row. They were weaponizing their prestige to turn me into a punchline. I stood perfectly still. My heart didn't race. My DIA training took over. a cold analytical bridge forming over the chasm of the insult. I recalled a truth that had saved me in darker places than this. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply watched them. I watched the way Othella's lip curled in triumph and the way Sloan looked at his watch, already calculating the value of the estate he thought was now his. They thought they were looking at a broken daughter. They had no idea they were looking at a professional who had just seen her target's first mistake. The air in the Fairmont felt suddenly toxic. I turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, the sound of Othella's charity fading behind me. The late autumn wind hit me like a slap as I stepped onto the sidewalk of Copley Square. The blue streetlights reflected off the damp pavement, clinical and cold. A black SUV sat idling at the curb. The window rolled down, revealing Rafferty. He didn't ask how the party was. He didn't need to. He stepped out and draped a heavy wool coat over my shoulders, a gesture of genuine protection from a man who knew exactly who I was and what I had done for this country. "It's starting, isn't it?" Rafferty asked softly. I looked back at the Fairmont, at the golden light spilling out of the windows where my mother was still selling my dignity for applause. Forgiveness isn't for the offender. It's the boundary that protects my own peace. But justice is a different matter entirely. "They've made their move, Rafferty," I said, my voice as cold as the Boston wind. "They think they're playing a game of social standing. They don't realize I've already moved the board." I pulled out a secure mobile device. A notification flashed. Access granted. Vault 712. Elias Halloway. My father hadn't left me a fortune. He had left me a detonator. The battle for the will was never about the money. It was about the truth he had died protecting. A truth that Othella and Sloan were about to find out was far more dangerous than any lie. "We go to the house tomorrow," I said, stepping into the vehicle. "They think they are treating a patient. They don't realize they've invited an operative into their house." The Halloway estate stood like a tombstone against the gray morning sky of Brookline. As the car pulled up the winding gravel driveway, the colonial mansion's white pillars looked less like architecture and more like the bars of a very expensive cage. I stepped out of the SUV, the chill of the Massachusetts air biting through my coat, but it was the atmosphere inside the house that I knew would be freezing. My mother and brother hadn't just invited me home for breakfast. They had set the stage for a clinical siege. I entered the sun-drenched breakfast room, where the scent of expensive Arabica coffee and lemon polish masked the underlying stench of a trap. Othella sat at the head of the mahogany table, her silk robe draped perfectly, her eyes tracking my every movement like a hawk watching a field mouse. Sloan was beside her, his fingers drumming a frantic, silent rhythm on the tablecloth. The sound of a silver spoon clinking against a porcelain saucer was the only music in the room. "Sit down, Viana," Othella said, her voice a forced melody of maternal concern. "You look exhausted. Your father's passing has clearly taken a toll on your stability." I sat, my spine never touching the back of the chair. I watched the steam rise from my teacup, the vapor obscuring my vision for just a second. I knew the exits were blocked. The heavy oak doors were closed, and two of Sloan's associates were visible through the glass of the conservatory. They called it family supervision. I called it unlawful detention under the guise of medical necessity. "We've brought someone to help you," Sloan added, leaning forward with a smile that felt like wet paper. He gestured toward a man sitting in the corner shadows. "This is Dr. Eris Thorne. He's a specialist. He's here to make sure you're fit for the upcoming legal proceedings." Dr. Thorne stepped into the light, his clinical air polished to a mirror finish. I recognized the type immediately, a man whose morality was as flexible as his billing hours. He opened a leather valise and produced a small, translucent orange bottle. I didn't need to see the label to know that in a house built on greed, the most dangerous weapon isn't a firearm. It's a prescription pad in the hands of a mercenary. Before the doctor spoke, I caught a glimpse of Mrs. Gable, the housemaid, standing by the sideboard. Her knuckles were white as she clutched a serving tray, her eyes darting between me and Othella in terror. I reached out as she walked by, briefly squeezing her hand. "Don't worry, Mrs. Gable," I whispered, loud enough for only her to hear. "Kindness is the only currency that doesn't lose value in a house like this. Go on to the kitchen." She gave a small, trembling nod and scurried away. My mother's eyes narrowed, but she didn't comment. She was too focused on the small white pill that Dr. Thorne was now placing on a silver coaster in front of me. "This is a mild cognitive stabilizer, Viana," Thorne said, his voice dripping with false empathy. "It will help with the delusions about your work in Washington. We need you clear-headed when we discuss the will." My DIA training identified the substance almost instantly. It wasn't a stabilizer. It was a powerful cognitive suppressant, a chemical leash designed to induce compliance and fog the memory. If I took that pill, I wouldn't just be clear-headed, I would be a puppet. "I understand," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I played the role of the broken, submissive daughter. I let my shoulders slump. I let my gaze lose its sharp edge. I picked up the coaster. Under the watchful, predatory eyes of my mother and brother, I raised the pill to my lips. Using a magician's palm, a skill honed in the back alleys of foreign capitals, I flicked the pill into the hollow compartment of the ring my father had given me. I followed the motion with a long sip of tea, my throat moving in a convincing swallow. "There," I said, leaning back and letting my eyelids droop slightly. "Is that better?" Othella's posture relaxed. Sloan actually smirked. They thought they had won. They thought the wolf had been muzzled. I watched them through half-closed eyes, reflecting on the fact that a predator doesn't need to howl to prove it has teeth. It only needs to wait for the moon to rise. They had mistaken my silence for defeat, but in my world, silence is just the space where you calibrate your sights. By afternoon, the house had grown quiet, the medical supervision relaxing, as they believed the sedative had taken hold. I retreated to my room, locking the door and moving with the silent efficiency of an operative. I pulled a miniature recording device from the lining of my coat, a piece of kit the family's high-priced security had completely missed. I had slipped a similar device into Dr. Thorne's bag while he was busy adjusting his stethoscope. I tapped into the feed. The audio was crisp. I heard the muffled sound of Sloan's laughter in the downstairs study, followed by the clink of ice in a glass. "She's out for the count," Sloan's voice crackled through the speaker. "Good work, Thorne. Once the judge sees her in that state tomorrow, declaring her incompetent will be a formality. The estate remains in the family. Your bonus will be wired by midnight." "It's a heavy dose, Sloan," Thorne replied. "She won't remember the conversation, let alone the will reading. Just make sure your mother stays on script." I listened to them plan my erasure with the clinical detachment of a scientist. I didn't feel the sting of betrayal anymore. That had died years ago. Instead, I felt a surge of strategic power. I carefully placed the poisoned pill into a forensic evidence bag, sealing it with a label that followed the strict federal chain of custody. I looked at the portrait of my father, Elias, hanging on the wall. He was the only one who had known the truth about my life, the only one who had seen the weight I carried. Othella and Sloan thought they were locking me in a glass cage, but they were wrong. They were the ones trapped. They had spent their lives believing money could buy any truth, but they were about to learn that the law has a very long memory for those who try to poison it. The blue light from the recorder illuminated the dark corners of my room, casting long, sharp shadows. I wasn't the victim they wanted me to be. I was the interrogation officer, and I had just collected the first confession. The silence of this house was no longer a threat. I whispered into the dark. It was a recording studio where my enemies were singing their own death warrants. The ride to the law offices of Rafferty and Associates was a study in suffocating silence. I sat in the back of the town car, flanked by Othella and Sloan, who treated my presence like a foul odor they were forced to endure. They didn't speak to me. They didn't even look at my way. This was their preferred weapon, a cold, systematic exclusion designed to make me feel like a stranger in my own skin. But as I watched the Boston Harbor skyline rise to meet us, I felt a strange, icy calm. I knew something they didn't. The patient they thought they had sedated was actually the only person in the car who was truly awake. We stepped into the high-rise office, where the late afternoon sun bled across the floor in long, jagged streaks of orange. Rafferty's conference room was a sanctuary of mahogany and leather, smelling of old paper and expensive tobacco. I took my seat at the far end of the table. Dust motes danced in the light, swirling slowly as Rafferty retrieved a heavy, cream-colored envelope from his desk. The only sound was the rhythmic, clinical sliding of his silver letter opener through the thick paper. My heart performed a steady, controlled thrum in my chest. Rafferty cleared his throat, his eyes flicking to me for a brief supportive second before he began to read. He moved through the standard legal jargon, the real estate holdings in Beacon Hill, the family trust, the liquid assets. Othello sat with her chin tilted high, the picture of grieving dignity, while Sloan leaned forward, his eyes hungry for the numbers. Then the air in the room seemed to thin as Rafferty reached a specific handwritten clause. To my youngest daughter, Vianna, Rafferty read, his voice gaining a solemn depth. For her unseen sacrifices, her unwavering courage, and her quiet service to this nation which she could never speak of, I bequeath the majority share of the Holloway estate, including the primary residence and controlling interest in the family legacy. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. Instead, I felt a crushing, beautiful weight in my lungs. For the first time since he drew his last breath, I felt truly seen by my father. He had known. He had always known. But the peace of that moment was shattered by a violent, guttural sound from across the table. Othello stood so abruptly her chair screeched against the hardwood. Her face, usually a mask of porcelain perfection, was now a mottled, furious red. She slammed her palm onto the mahogany table with a force that made the water glasses jump. "I will not stand for this!" she screamed, her voice jagged and ugly. "This is an insult to your father's memory. Vianna, you are a liar and a thief. You manipulated a dying, confused man with these pathetic fairy tales of Washington heroics just to steal what rightfully belongs to your brother." Sloan rose beside her, his face twisted into a sneer of pure venom. "She's a fraud, Rafferty. We have proof. Her government job was a clerical position in a bookstore. This is stolen valor, plain and simple. It's a disgrace to every real soldier who ever wore a uniform. You think you can use a fake career to buy our father's love? You're a pathetic con artist, Vianna." The accusation of stolen valor hung in the air like a poisonous fog. In our circles, there is no deeper brand of shame. I remained perfectly still, my hands folded on the table. I looked at Othello, and for the first time I didn't feel the old sting of her rejection. I felt a profound, distant pity. Truth is not a commodity that requires a loud voice or a slammed fist to be valid. It simply is. "Mother," I said, my voice low and steady, cutting through her hysteria like a scalpel. "A legacy isn't built on what you take from the dead, but on what you honor for the living. You and Sloan are fighting for bricks and bank accounts. I am honoring a promise I made to a man who saw through the theater of this family long before I did." "Don't you dare talk to me about honor," Othello hissed, her fingers trembling as she pointed at the door. "You are nothing. You have always been nothing but a shadow." I didn't answer. I stood up slowly, the movement graceful and deliberate. I needed air, but more than that, I needed the one thing I had kept tucked away since the night before. I walked to the window, looking out at the harbor as Rafferty began a heated legal back and forth with Sloan's lawyers. In the quiet corner of the room, I pulled my father's vintage pilot watch from my pocket. It was a heavy piece of steel, worn smooth by his skin. My fingers found the hidden release on the back of the casing, a detail only an operative or a master jeweler would ever notice. With a faint click, the back plate swung open. Tucked inside, nestled against the ticking heart of the watch, was a micro SIM card. My breath hitched. My fingers trembled as I slipped the card into the secure mobile reader I carried. A video file appeared on the screen. It was Elias, filmed in the harsh, clinical light of his study just weeks before he passed. His face was thin, but his eyes, the same eyes I see in the mirror, were burning with a fierce, protective clarity. "Vianna," his voice crackled through the small speaker, sounding like a ghost whispering in my ear. "I knew they would try to erase you. I knew your work as Echo 7 required you to be a shadow, and I knew your mother would never forgive you for being a light she couldn't control. I've left a trigger in the will, a legal tripwire they won't understand until they've already crossed it. Hold the line, my brave girl. Your service was never a secret to me. Mission first. I love you." I closed the watch with a sharp, metallic snap that seemed to echo through the room, silencing the bickering lawyers. I turned back to the table, and for the first time, the librarian was gone. The woman standing there was Echo 7, and she was done playing defense. I looked at Rafferty, my gaze as sharp as a bayonet. "They wanted a legal battle based on a lie, Rafferty," I said, my voice vibrating with a new, lethal authority. "They think I'm a patient to be managed or a ghost to be exorcised. Let's give them a federal reckoning based on the absolute, unvarnished truth." Sloan laughed, a hollow, desperate sound. "You and what army, Viana?" I didn't smile. I didn't need to. I simply sat back down and waited for the clock to strike the hour. The SIM card was more than a digital file. It was my father's hand reaching out from the grave to hand me the sword I needed to end this war. I sat in the absolute darkness of my childhood bedroom at the Halloway estate, the air thick with the scent of old wood and the heavy, stagnant silence of a house that had become a battlefield. My DIA training had long ago replaced the need for restful sleep with a state of high-alert observation. I didn't need a nightlight. I had the rhythmic vibration of the house, the subtle groans of the floorboards, and the shifting shadows of the oak trees outside my window. Through the sliver of light beneath my door, I tracked the movement in the hallway. I listened to the hollow sound of Sloan's footsteps. They were hesitant, lacking the confident stride he displayed in public. It's a painful truth that the deepest cuts don't come from enemies across a border. They come from the person who used to share your dinner table, someone who knows exactly where your heart is and how to aim for the center. I sensed him pausing outside my room. He wasn't there to reconcile or apologize for these stolen valor insults. He was there to finish the job Othello had started at the gala. I remember a rainy afternoon when I was 10. My father, Elias, called me to his study after Sloan blamed me for a broken vase I hadn't touched. He told me that silence was the best response to a fool, but preparation was the only response to a traitor. He had trained me for this moment long before I knew anything about the Defense Intelligence Agency. I didn't move. I didn't reach for the light. I simply blended into the darkness, watching the doorknob turn with the cold, emotionless gaze of a predator. Through a miniature security lens I'd hidden in a decorative mirror, part of the kit Rafferty had helped me secure, I watched the digital feed on my phone. Sloan slipped into my room like a ghost of greed. He moved toward my open luggage, his face illuminated for a split second by the hallway light. He looked frantic, his eyes darting around the room. I watched him pull a thick, official-looking folder from under his jacket and slide it deep into the side pocket of my suitcase. It was the Trojan horse. Sloan was planting highly classified corporate intelligence and forged government secrets in my belongings, a desperate attempt to frame me for treason before I could present the truth to the judge. I chose not to intervene. I could have stepped out and confronted him, but in the world of high-stakes intelligence, the crime must be fully committed for the reckoning to be absolute. I felt a flash of genuine, cold sadness for him. Greed is a hungry ghost that eventually devours the person who feeds it. Sloan retreated, closing the door with a soft click that sounded like a hammer falling into place. I sat back against the wall, my fingers brushing the cool steel of my father's watch. The trap was set, but it wasn't the one Sloan intended. I spent the next few hours calmly verifying my own secure evidence, ensuring the DIA encrypted files were hidden where no local or federal raid would ever find them. I was ready for the storm. I just had to wait for the dawn. At exactly 4 a.m., the silence was shattered. Flashlights cut through the morning mist, their beams dancing across my bedroom walls like frantic spirits. The sound of heavy boots on the gravel driveway and the sharp, rhythmic pounding on the front door echoed through the mansion. Red and blue lights began to pulse against the white pillars of the estate, turning the colonial sanctuary into a crime scene. Federal agents were executing a search warrant based on the anonymous tip Sloan had likely placed hours ago. "Federal agents, open up!" The command was muffled by the thick oak doors, but the authority was unmistakable. I heard Sloan's voice downstairs, pitched in a perfect tone of shocked and devastated brotherly concern. He was playing the part for the neighbors, for the agents, and for his own ego. I stood up, smoothed my clothes, and waited. When the agents burst into my room, I didn't flinch. I didn't scream. I simply raised my hands and treated them with the professional respect they deserved. "Vianna Halloway?" the lead agent asked, his flashlight blinding me. I gave a slow, steady nod. He read me my rights as he snapped the cold steel cuffs around my wrists. I didn't resist. I knew these men were just pieces on a larger board, pawns in a game they didn't yet realize they were losing. As they led me down the grand staircase, I saw Othello standing at the top of the landing. She was draped in silk, looking down at me as if I were a common criminal who had finally been caught. The look in her eyes finalized the emotional severance between us. There was no motherly concern, no doubt, only a chilling satisfaction. I realized then that I hadn't just been excluded from the family. I had been surgically removed from their conscience. As the agents escorted me toward the waiting black SUV, the cameras of a local news crew, doubtless tipped off by Sloan, began to flash. The strobe light effect made the world feel fragmented and unreal. I caught Sloan's eye across the driveway. He stood by the fountain, a tiny, triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He thought this was the end. He thought the cuffs were a sign of my defeat and his victory. He had no idea that those handcuffs were the only thing keeping him safe from the legal hurricane I was about to unleash. As the cold steel bit into my wrists, I didn't feel like a prisoner. I felt like the bait in a trap that had finally been sprung, and the clock had finally struck the hour. The dawn air was still biting as the black SUV pulled away from the Halloway estate, but the chill inside the federal field office was of a different kind. I was led into a stark, windowless interrogation room, the walls a depressing shade of eggshell white that had seen 1,000 desperate confessions. The lead investigator, a man with tired eyes and a suit that didn't quite fit, sat across from me. He slammed the thick folder Sloan had planted in my bag onto the metal table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the cold surface. He began his aggressive questioning, weaving a narrative of corporate espionage and the stolen secrets, using the very documents my brother had tucked into my luggage. I remained unmoved, watching him with a clinical detachment that clearly unsettled him. I knew exactly which protocols were being triggered. I wasn't listening to his words. I was waiting for the building's acoustic sensors to catch the rhythm I was about to create. My index finger began to tap. It was a rhythmic, persistent sound, the Morse code for a Priority 1 extraction. I was Vianna, but in this moment, I was Echo 7, and I was calling in the cavalry. True power doesn't need to explain itself to those who lack the clearance to understand the stakes. As the investigator leaned in, his face inches from mine, I offered him a calm, humanitarian smile that stopped him mid-sentence. "You are doing your job with integrity, sir," I said, my voice low and steady. "I respect the oath you took. It is truly a shame that you were handed a weapon by my brother that was designed to backfire on everyone in this room." Before he could respond, the heavy steel door was kicked open. The sound was explosive, followed by the rapid, rhythmic thud of tactical boots. A team in plain clothes, bearing Department of Defense insignias that commanded immediate silence, swarmed the room. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered as the building's local network was seized by a superior authority. The investigator stood frozen, his hand still resting on the fraudulent evidence. The lead operative, a man I'd worked with on 3 continents, stepped forward and presented a superseding national security warrant. He didn't look at the investigator, he looked at me. The jurisdiction was seized in a matter of seconds. They revealed the truth that Sloan's small mind couldn't conceive. The documents he had planted were actually part of a long-standing honeypot sting operation I had been overseeing. By planting them, Sloan hadn't framed me. He had walked directly into a federal trap designed to catch foreign intermediaries. "Extraction complete, Echo 7, the commander said, his voice a professional drone. "You're clear." I was uncuffed, the cold steel falling away with a hollow clatter. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply stood up and adjusted my blazer, my mind already 3 steps ahead. A man who builds a pit for his sister eventually forgets that he is the one standing on the precarious edge. I asked the commander if Sloan had been notified of the current status. He confirmed that my brother was likely still giving his triumphant statement to the local press, unaware that the floor was about to vanish beneath his feet. The commander offered me a secure line. I didn't call a lawyer. I called Rafferty. The manila envelope, the one my father had died protecting, needed to be in the judge's hands by the time I arrived at the courthouse. I was done being the librarian they could push around. The storm had arrived, and I was the one directing the wind. The transition from the sterile office to the SUV was a blur of tactical movement. As we sped toward the Massachusetts State House, I looked at the small screen in the back of the vehicle. Sloan was on the local news broadcast, standing in front of our childhood home. He was feigning tears, lamenting the fall of his troubled criminal sister. He was weaponizing the media to destroy my reputation before the will reading could even conclude, hoping a default judgment would hand him the keys to the kingdom. I watched him with a profound sense of realization. My family had traded their souls and the memory of my father for a fleeting moment of television fame. I felt a surge of resilience, not because I wanted revenge, but because I owed it to Elias to ensure the Halloway name wasn't permanently stained by Sloan's greed. I instructed my team to maintain absolute radio silence. The more Sloan talked, the deeper the hole he was digging for himself under the Espionage Act. The SUV pulled up to the courthouse, and the sea of reporters surged forward. The cameras flashed like strobe lights, blinding and relentless. They didn't see the woman who had spent a decade in the shadows. They saw the shadow of a reckoning they weren't prepared to handle. I turned to my lead agent, my expression unreadable behind my dark sunglasses. "Let them take the pictures," I said, my voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal power. By noon, the only story they'll be reporting is how a financier turned his own family's history into a federal crime scene. As I stepped out of the car, the roar of the crowd felt like white noise. I walked through the mob with my head held high, the weight of the manila envelope in Rafferty's hand feeling like a promise kept. I wasn't just Vianna Halloway today. I was the consequence of their choices. The roar of the mob outside the Suffolk County Courthouse was a wall of sound that I breached with a fixed, stoic expression. Flashbulbs popped like silent explosions, but I didn't blink. I walked between the plainclothes federal marshals, their presence a silent shield against the reporters Sloan had summoned to witness my supposed downfall. Rafferty walked beside me, his hand firmly gripping the manila envelope. Inside that courtroom, the theater of family dysfunction was about to be replaced by the cold, unyielding weight of federal authority. I was Vianna, the woman they had spent a lifetime trying to minimize. But today, I was the storm they hadn't bothered to forecast. Entering the courtroom felt like stepping into a vacuum. The high ceilings and dark wood paneling swallowed the noise of the city, leaving only the rhythmic clicking of my heels on the marble floor. I took my seat at the defense table, feeling the heat of Othella's gaze from the front row. She was dressed in elaborate widow's weeds, a silk veil pushed back to reveal eyes that she had expertly reddened for the cameras. Beside her, Sloan leaned over to whisper to a team of lawyers whose suits cost more than most people's annual salaries. The gallery was packed, a sea of hungry eyes waiting for the stolen valor scandal of the decade. Othella was the first to take the stand. She didn't just speak, she performed. Her voice was a practiced tremolo of heartbreak as she recounted my history of delusions. She told the court how I had used Elias's late-stage dementia to hack my way into his affections, claiming I had manipulated him with fake stories of Washington heroics. "She's just a fake soldier," Othella sobbed, dabbing a pristine lace handkerchief at her eyes. "She stole her brother's inheritance using the uniform she never had the courage to wear." Sloan followed her, presenting a stack of forged bank records and testimonies from a bookstore in D.C., where I had supposedly spent the last decade. He was smug, his chest puffed out with the arrogance of a man who believes money can buy any version of the truth. I sat perfectly still, my breathing deep and controlled. I remembered my father's quiet wisdom. A lie is a sprint, but the truth is a marathon. Looking at Othella now, I felt a strange, detached compassion. She had traded her youngest daughter for a script written by a failing financier. That realization didn't hurt anymore. It just made the coming transition easier. Then Rafferty rose. He didn't make a speech. He didn't argue. He simply walked to the bench and handed the sealed manila envelope to Judge Halloway. The room fell into a sudden, expectant hush. The cinematic tension was almost physical. a pressurized bubble waiting to burst. I watched the judge's face as he broke the red wax seal. The sound of the paper sliding out was as sharp as a blade being unsheathed in a silent room. The change in Judge Holloway was instantaneous. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a mask of profound, ashen shock. He scanned the classification markings at the top of the document, the official seal of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. He looked at my service record, the list of commendations for missions that didn't officially exist, and the verified status of Echo 7. His eyes darted toward me, then toward the marshals standing at the doors. "Officers, seal this court immediately." The judge's gavel hit the wood with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. "Clear the gallery. All recording devices are to be seized and wiped. This matter is now a classified federal proceeding." The chaos that followed was swift. Reporters were ushered out by armed guards. The heavy oak doors were bolted from the inside. The spectacle of shame Sloan had built was dismantled in 60 seconds, replaced by the suffocating tension of a room that had just become a skiff. Othello and Sloan were left sitting at their table, their mouths agape, looking around like children who had realized the playground was actually a minefield. Real honor doesn't need a parade, I thought. It only needs a record that the law is bound to respect. The judge turned his gaze toward Sloan. The pity was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical disgust. He reached for the second part of the manila envelope, the evidence my team had spent months gathering while Othello and Sloan thought I was just the librarian. "Mr. Holloway," the judge said, his voice vibrating with a lethal resonance. "This court has received evidence that your investment firm has been serving as a conduit for money laundering involving foreign entities that are currently under DIA surveillance. The very evidence you planted in your sister's luggage was part of a monitored federal honeypot. You didn't frame a criminal. You exposed a treasonous network that you yourself are deeply entangled in." Othello stood up, her face a mask of frantic confusion. She tried to reach for a folder on the table, a desperate attempt to destroy her own forged records. A marshal stepped in her way, his hand resting on his sidearm. I stood up then, my posture perfect, my voice calm and low. "Mother," I said softly, the words carrying further than Othello's screams ever could. "You didn't just lose a lawsuit today. You lost the only person who was standing between this family and a federal indictment. You trade in reputations. I trade in security. You should have checked which one had the higher clearance." The legal reality crashed down on them like a falling building. Sloan wasn't the plaintiff anymore. He was a target. He was being read his rights under the Espionage Act in a room he had intended for my humiliation. Othello turned to me, her veil snagged on her earring, her voice a shrill, desperate plea. "Vianna, tell them it's a mistake. Tell them you're just a librarian. You're my daughter, you have to fix this." I looked at the judge, then back at the woman who had spent 30 years trying to erase me. The bow dung, the grace was still there, but the daughter she knew was gone. I had fulfilled my promise to Elias. I had protected the legacy, but I was no longer obligated to protect the lies. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady and clear. "The librarian is finished. Please proceed with the federal warrants. My service to this family ended the moment they tried to poison the truth." The heavy oak doors of the Suffolk County Courthouse swung open, releasing me into a world that felt fundamentally different. 6 months had passed since the day the court was sealed, yet the memory of that clinical silence remained etched in my mind. Rain began to fall over Boston, a gentle, cleansing mist that blurred the sharp edges of the granite buildings. I stood at the top of the stone steps, watching a scene play out in the slow, deliberate rhythm of a final act. A black sedan sat idling at the curb, its roof slick with moisture. U.S. Marshals escorted Sloan toward the vehicle. He looked smaller than I remembered. His expensive suit was rumpled, his posture broken by the weight of a federal indictment he could no longer bribe his way out of. I felt a strange, detached pity as I watched him. The man who had spent his life chasing shadows of wealth was now being consumed by them. Othello stood a few feet away, her cracking voice cutting through the damp air as she lunged toward me, her face a mask of bewildered fury. "How could you?" she screamed, her eyes searching mine for a flicker of the daughter she thought she could control. "Why did you destroy your own brother, Vianna? Why did you destroy this family?" Rafferty stepped forward before I could speak, his expression as unyielding as the stone pillars behind us. "She didn't destroy this family, Othella. She saved what was left of its honor. For the last 10 years, while you were busy slandering her name, Vianna was using her DIA salary to quietly pay off Elias's medical debts and Sloan's early gambling losses. She protected the Holloway name while the two of you were trying to sell it to the highest bidder." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of Othella's realization. She looked at me, her mouth opening and closing like a bird gasping for air. The truth was a blow she hadn't prepared for. I reached into my pocket and handed her a single, notarized document. It was a final act of humanitarian grace, a modest, irrevocable trust I had established for her care. It ensured she would never be homeless or hungry, even as the empire Sloan built on lies crumbled to ash. "Forgiveness isn't about letting you back into my life, Mother," I said, my voice steady and calm against the hum of the city. "It's about letting the weight of you go so I can finally walk straight. I'm not your librarian anymore, and I'm certainly not your victim. I am simply the guardian of what Elias actually valued." I turned away, leaving her standing in the rain with the ghost of her choices. My heels echoed on the marble floors of the Holloway Financial Building as I entered the lobby an hour later. Workers were already on ladders, carefully prying the old Jensen and Sloan signage from the wall. The transition was methodical and empowering. I had purchased the building at auction, using the resources my father had secured and the DIA's backing to prevent it from falling into the hands of Sloan's foreign creditors. I walked through the corridors that once smelled of my brother's arrogance. The top floors were already being outfitted as a DIA satellite office, a secure hub for the very work my family claimed was a delusion. The ground floors, however, were being transformed into something far more personal, a foundation for the families of fallen service members. Rafferty met me in the executive suite, handing over the final legal documents. Under Massachusetts law, the Holloway legacy was now officially restored, but redefined by service rather than greed. "Elias would be proud, Vianna," Rafferty said, leaning against the window. "He didn't leave you that money to make you rich. He left it to make you the guardian of the truth." "He knew that service over self wasn't just a motto for me," I replied, looking out at the city. "It was the only way I knew how to live. I was never a shadow. I was the foundation they forgot to check." As the afternoon sun began to dip below the skyline, I climbed the stairs to the rooftop. Boston glittered beneath me like a vast electric circuit board, vibrant and alive. I pulled my father's pilot watch from my pocket and checked the time. 6 o'clock. My phone buzzed in my hand, a final, frantic text from Othella filled with entitled expectations and empty apologies. I stared at the screen for a moment, feeling the vast, quiet stillness inside of me. I pressed the block button. It wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of liberation. The mission Elias had given me was complete. I was no longer the fake soldier or the invisible daughter. I was the master of my own silence. That journey was never about inheritance. The roar of the helicopter echoed in the distance, its silhouette tearing through the evening mist. I walked toward the edge of the roof, the wind drowning out the ghosts of the past. I stepped out of their world and into my own.